The college football season is finally here, and it's a season of change with the arrival of the 12-team playoff. What's that mean for the regular season, though? Does the regular season mean more, less, or about the same as ever? Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. John, as I was watching the Week 0 games, in particular Florida State's surprising season opening loss in Ireland to Georgia Tech, I was thinking, does the expansion of the playoff change the stakes of the regular season? Obviously, several SEC teams will be playing marquee games this weekend. Georgia, Clemson, LSU, Southern Cal, Miami goes to Florida, and then Notre Dame at Texas A&M. Those are the four marquee games in the SEC. Now, in the 4-team playoff, it wasn't exactly win or go home in week 1, but we know there was very little margin for error in the 4-team playoff era. In the 12-team playoff era, there could be, theoretically anyway, a little more margin for error. So as I saw Florida State lose to Georgia Tech, I think the knee-jerk reaction is, well, Florida State's done. They're not making the playoff. And yet I thought, why can't they make the playoff? In theory, they could still win the ACC, claim an auto bid. What's your take on this? Do you think the expansion of the playoff made the regular season more or less relevant, more or less important? How do you view the effect of one on the other?
Yeah, I think it makes every game almost more important because there's so many teams can make the playoffs, and we're going to be looking at comparative scores, and we're going to be evaluating the strength of the conference, be it ACC, SEC, or whomever. So I think it means so much more. I'm watching the Florida State Georgia Tech game, and I'm looking at it from a playoff perspective. And you're right. That doesn't mean Florida State is done. It can win the ACC. But I wasn't thinking about it winning the ACC. I was looking at it from a different viewpoint. If the ACC hoped to get 2 teams in the playoff, a conference champion and an at-large team, I think that game might have killed it. I think, though it's just one game, and certainly a lot can happen. However, Florida State and Clemson are usually the 2 teams you look at could make it from that league. If you get 2, you might say also Miami is a possibility. SMU is maybe a long shot. So there are not that many teams, and that to me is clearly the weakest of the 4 Power 4 conferences. So that was just a brutal hit for the ACC. Now, Florida State, you're right. It can win the rest of its games, beat Clemson, and it's good. It can win the championship, but that loss to Georgia Tech will, I think, hurt the ACC overall when it comes to getting more teams in the playoff. And because there's so many teams that can get in, I just think it makes so many more meaningful games. You might be watching a mediocre Big Ten teams play, but if one of those mediocre teams happens to upset a playoff hopeful in the Big Ten, then it factors in a lot. So I find it more interesting, really.
Yeah, I think the season is more interesting for sure with a 12-team playoff. I do wonder about this idea of every game mattering more. Um, I think you lose me a little bit on that one, depending on the conference you're talking about. I think when I look at the SEC, I think that holds up a little bit because we've talked about the SEC could maybe qualify 5 playoff teams, and perhaps as many or 9 or as 9 or 10 might be in contention. And so I do think the argument holds up pretty well in the SEC, where there's going to be so many at-large qualifiers. You could be splitting hairs when it comes down to the final team. You could be debating for the final spot in the playoff 10-2 teams. And it's based on strength of schedule and how'd you look versus common opponents. But I think for other conferences, I think that argument loses a little bit of weight. And I think about the ACC in particular, and maybe it's just the difference of how we viewed the conference. I already had the ACC in my mind as very likely a one-bid league coming into the season. I thought it was only going to get its auto bid, and that's that. So when I look at Florida State's loss to Georgia Tech, I think, okay, that maybe reworks about Florida State, but does it really affect their playoff chances that much? Because if they win the rest of their ACC games, I mean, even if they were to lose to Notre Dame, that doesn't affect their spot in the ACC standings. So if they win the rest of their ACC games, beat Clemson, beat Miami, they're probably going to make the ACC championship game, and then they would have a one-game play-in essentially to get into the playoff. You win the ACC championship, no questions asked. You get the automatic bid. You're going to be in the playoff. So I guess for me, it just depends on what conference we're talking about. I think for the ACC and to a lesser extent the Big 12, you want to go to the playoff, you better win your conference championship game. Otherwise, you're really leaving yourself in a vulnerable spot anyway to make the playoff. And so, it's kind of all steam ahead toward the conference championship games. But the Big 10 and the SEC, where I think they're going to get several at-large bids, particularly with the SEC, I do think the regular season carries a ton of weight because it's not just all about getting to Atlanta. It's about building a resume to where you can get selected for the playoff, even if you don't make it to the conference championship game in Atlanta.
Yeah, it's and I agree with you. Going into when we picked our playoff teams last year, I had one team from the ACC.
Mm-hmm.
So I looked at that Georgia Tech Florida State game. I didn't look at it as what I thought. I looked at it as what the ACC would hope for. I think the ACC could at least hope, well, maybe we can get an at-large team in too if games break a certain way. And that's why I thought that game was so significant, because it broke the wrong way for the ACC. I'll give you another example. See, I look at the Big 12. I think it'll have multiple teams in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a stronger conference in the ACC. And a game I look at as very significant in the opener is West Virginia versus Penn State. It's in Morgantown. To me, that's a huge game, not just for West Virginia, but for the ACC. I don't think of West Virginia as a playoff contender, but I think of it as a middle of the road Big 12 team. But if a middle of the road Big 12 team, best case scenario, you win 8 games regular season, get a 9th win in a bowl game. If a middle of the road Big 12 team can beat Penn State, which is generally considered a strong playoff possibility, and which is maybe, I don't know, the third best team,
I think so.
a consensus third best team in the Big 10. If West Virginia pulls that off, I just think that really helps the Big 12. I'm assuming the selection committee will do its job and look at these kind of games and really focus on them when you have these non-conference games. So that's another example. But see, I do have multiple teams in from the Big 12, so I think of that as an important game. It's not the only way that the Big 12 would get multiple teams in, but I just think if it did that, that's an example of a game that's really could be meaningful.
You're really going for that West Virginia NIL sponsorship, John. I really think that's what it comes back to. West Virginia and Oklahoma State, those are your two programs. You need pennants on the wall in the background for West Virginia and Oklahoma State. I think you got room on the wall for a couple pennants. Surely for those teams, you'd make some room.
To be honest, I've won so many awards, Blake. There's no more room. I
Okay.
I should have written a little worse a couple of those years, I guess.
Well, keep that
Not
in mind.
boasting, but
Keep that in mind for the future. You don't got any more room for awards, so just lock it in at average. Set the cruise to 65, and don't be doing any more than that. Yeah, so I think this idea, John, of like, does an individual game mean as much as it used to? I think it probably, I guess, to summarize what we're saying is it depends on your perspective. You've kind of made a case for maybe it means as much, if not more. I've laid out a bit of an argument for, well, maybe individual games don't matter as much as they used to. But I think what we're in agreement on is that the totality of the season is more interesting with a 12-team playoff. Whether one individual game carries as much weight or not, open to debate. The season as a whole, I think, is going to be more interesting. And one of the things I'm interested by in this opening weekend is the continued perception of the ACC because, I mean, it took it on the chin a little bit with Florida State losing, even though it was a conference game. I mean, Florida State's demise makes Georgia Tech look better, but nobody is talking about Georgia Tech as a potential playoff team. But, and I know neither one of us thinks the ACC is going to be a two-bid league. We're in agreement. We think the ACC is going to be a one-bid league. But their chances for two, I mean, they could almost be extinct after this weekend when you consider Clemson plays Georgia, and then Miami goes to Florida. Two of the top teams in the conference. Florida State's already got a loss. If Georgia just runs over Clemson, and if Florida can beat Miami in the swamp, I think at that point you could pretty well stick a fork in the idea of the ACC getting two teams. They're getting whoever wins the conference championship, and that's it. What do you think about that? I mean, do those two games have the possibility to eliminate? I know we're already saying it's unlikely the ACC gets two, but if both of those games are losses for the ACC, does that kill off the idea of the ACC getting two teams?
Yeah, I guess it could be problematic. If Clemson played Georgia down to the wire and lost on a last-minute field goal,
true,
that would count as a win for the ACC. I don't see that happening. But no, I agree with you on that. And I just look at it. See, I look at it even when I was watching the SMU Nevada game Saturday. I mean, SMU was a 20-something point favorite over Nevada, which had 4 wins in the last 2 seasons combined, got a new coach, brought in a lot of transfers, but still, if you look at SMU with a lot of starters returning and maybe 15 or so, you kind of looked at SMU as maybe a dark horse in that ACC if it gets, wins some key games along the way. And to me, that game was almost like a loss because you lose to the team that was picked to finish last in the Mountain West. You beat them, rather, but you beat them in the last minute by a few points. It just doesn't help. So let's face it, the first week, it's 0 week, and it was 0 positive points for the ACC. It was disastrous, really.
I mentioned the Miami-Florida game, John. It's maybe not getting as much national buzz as a few of the other SEC games on the schedule because Florida comes in unranked. But I think it's one of the most interesting games on the docket, not just for the SEC, but anywhere in the country this week. I wrote about Billy Napier's status at Florida in a column this week because based on what we know about coaching tenures, he's facing heat. He's 11-14 after 2 seasons. That doesn't sit well at Florida. And when you add in the final year of the Dan Mullen era, which Napier is not responsible, but it does sort of affect the mood around the fan base, that was a losing season too. So it's 3 consecutive losing seasons at Florida. And hot seat has been a little bit of the undercurrent of the offseason for Billy Napier. It's not always stated outright. We'll state it outright because this is SEC football unfiltered. Locally, it seems like some of the Florida beat guys are a little more polite and won't put it in such blunt terms. But I think we think Billy's on the hot seat. And yet, I think about some factors at Florida that might kind of work in his favor if they can just play to respectability this year. Now, I know the schedule's brutal. It's one of the toughest schedules, maybe the toughest schedule in the country. But I'm wondering what you think about, like, how good does the record have to be for Billy Napier to see year 4? Because I want to introduce a couple factors here that Florida fans probably are aware of, but your average SEC fan may not realize. Florida right now has an interim president. Its president, Ben Sasse, resigned over the summer to take care of help care for his wife who's dealing with health problems. So right now Florida has an interim president who was the president when Billy Napier was hired as coach. Now, what do we know about interims? Well, typically you don't bring an interim in to make sweeping changes. You bring the interim in to keep the lights on, not to change the power company, right? You just want to make sure that basically that the business does not totally go underwater, the business being the university, while the interim's there, and you get the new head president in charge. And then you could say, well, why does this have to be involved in the president? Couldn't you just tap the AD with making a coaching change? Well, the AD at Florida is Scott Strickland, who hired and then fired Dan Mullen and then hired Billy Napier. Well, being an AD is not like baseball. Baseball is 3 strikes, you're out. Being an AD, you get 2 strikes. And if they both fail, if both your hires fail, you're out. You don't get to make a third hire typically as an AD. So I think that sort of kind of works to Billy Napier's advantage. The fact that there's an interim president, the AD you probably don't trust to make a third hire when you consider his past 2 hires were Dan Mullen, and Napier is protected by a $25 million buyout, which doesn't mean everything, but it's not totally inconsequential. So I still think if this season is a disaster for Florida, Napier's got to go. Even an interim president probably is going to wake up and realize you can't keep a coach who goes 3-9. But I wonder how good does it need to be for Florida and Napier to get this thing into 2025?
Well, I think Florida has to have a winning season. I think here's a possible path. Florida beats Miami, UCF, and Florida State. It beats all the in-state teams on its schedule. That's something you can put your hat on. It's not like winning SEC games. You still got a lot of rivals like Tennessee and Georgia and so forth that you don't want to be embarrassed. But I just think maybe with the scenario you laid out, if Napier could go 7-5 and his recruiting picks up this year and NIL people are willing to invest a lot more money, I have no idea why they should be. But I'm trying to get with the program here, the program you've laid out. I'm trying to find a path, but I don't think he has a shot. I think he's gone, and I think the AD's gone. I don't care whether the president's interim or not. Some companies bring in somebody to fire people, and then they bring in somebody else to run the company. Maybe that's what this interim man can do, because if you're Florida, can you have 3 consecutive losing seasons and keep your job as a football coach? I don't see how that's possible, because the way you have to look at it now, it's not just a record. When you go to alums and you say, hey, we want to keep Billy. We think we've got things going in the right direction. We've had some tough breaks, lost some close games, but Billy's got the foundation laid now. So how about writing us a check for $100,000 that we can apply to NIL? And if that person's personable is fairly lucid, he will look at you like you're insane. Why would you invest money in this product at this point? He's got to show you something. What has he showed you? And the recruiting class this year for the 2025 cycle is way down the list in the SEC. I just don't see how it's possible for him to get another year.
Poor Billy Napier. I'm laying out this idea that he can coach his way with some factors going in his favor to get to 2025, and you come in and just extinguish all hope. But I think you did hit on something that is part of my argument, is you have to win the games against the in-state rivals. That may not be enough, but that is a strong start in the direction of keeping his job until 2025. I mean, there's opportunities there against Miami, UCF, and Florida State. None of those teams seem unbeatable. Miami's a home game. Look what happened to Florida State against Georgia Tech. If Georgia Tech can beat Florida State, well, then Florida should be, expected to have a chance against Florida State. And UCF, a home game, that's a game Florida should be favored in. Those 3 in and of themselves, I don't think save Billy Napier, but I think that's a big step in the direction of him keeping his job next year. You look back on the Ron Zook era, a lot went wrong. Let's face it, about the Ron Zook era. Ron Zook went 0-4 against Miami and Florida State. Among the many, many things that went wrong for Ron Zook, that was one of the biggest, going 0-4 against in-state rivals Miami and Florida State. And Ron Zook did not make it through his 3rd season as Florida's coach. Was fired before he got to play Florida State a 3rd time. Didn't give him a chance to beat Florida State in that third meeting because he'd lost to him the 2 previous times and he lost to Miami twice. And so it's not enough to save Billy Napier beating Miami, but a loss to Miami in week 1, that pokes some pretty darn big holes in my idea that maybe this interim president will be content to just keep the lights on and shove this problem to the future president in 2025.
Well, that was a very reasonable scenario you laid out, and I was
That
kind of
you swatted
well.
down quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to get with it, and then I remembered the name of our show. It's SEC Unfiltered, and so I had to take off the filter that you put on Billy Napier and say, "There's no way."
Yeah, well, maybe I'm just waiting. And you fire a coach before week 1. I mean, there's really no coming back for that. Maybe I'm waiting for that fire Billy column until October at least, right?
Yeah,
You write that column before the season starts. And now you've done it. I know in your long storied career that won you all those awards, you've fired coaches in February. And your
yeah, but
column.
you make a good point. Once you fire them, what more can you say? That really wasn't a good move, but it was a slow day in February. Let's fire the coach. But then that comes back to get you. And after the season opener, you said, "Man, this coach needs to be fired." Oh, wait, I've already done that. You can't. It's like double indemnity. You can't fire him twice.
Wait, so I mentioned the Miami at the Swamp against Florida game. There's also another game that the sports books are saying is basically a coin flip, and that's Notre Dame at Texas A&M. Now we'll get to our picks portion of the podcast here in a bit, but just broad strokes, both those games are 2.5-point line. The Aggies are 2.5-point favorites against Notre Dame. Florida, despite being at home, 2.5-point underdog against Miami. Now, maybe you'll pick both SEC teams to win once we get to the picks portion, but I'm wondering just in general, which SEC team do you think is more dangerous, is better positioned in those 2 coin flip games? Texas A&M, do you like their positioning better, or Billy Napier's Gators?
Texas A&M has a bigger challenge. There's no doubt about that, but I do like Texas A&M. I like the Aggies when they're playing at home, and I like the Aggies when they're going to be playing in sweltering South Texas heat. Won't be that warm or that humid in Notre Dame when they're preparing for this game. I think that's going to be a problem for the Irish. And you've been there, College Station. You know how big that stadium is. You know how loud it can get in there. In a season opener with a new coach, I think the Aggies will be as fired up as they've been in a long time for an opener. Uh, and I don't dismiss Notre Dame as a possibility. The line says all you need to know. This is a close game. The odds makers are basically saying, "Oh, well, it's a pick 'em game," aside from the home field advantage. But I think the home field advantage is probably worth more than 2.5 points when you're playing at College Station. A lot depends on quarterbacks. And I thought Connor Wegman was doing pretty good. I thought he was on the right path before he got hurt last year. He's got some talent around him, good defense. Jimbo Fisher in NIL money did get a lot of players there to the Aggies. So I like Texas A&M more than I do Florida against Miami, simply because I just think A&M's a more complete team. And I'm just not sold on Florida overall. I certainly wouldn't rule out an upset possibility. The game could go either way. But if I had to pick one of those teams to win, I would go with the Aggies.
I think I'd almost go the other direction, and maybe I'm just putting the ACC in the dumpster after seeing Florida State lose. But if you remember last week, I picked Miami to win the ACC, but I said that doesn't mean they'll beat Florida in week 1. I almost think I think Miami loses in the Swamp and then goes on to win the ACC because it's got a pretty favorable ACC schedule, and I put a lot of respect on the Swamp as well. You mentioned Kyle Field, but the Swamp can be, as we know, pretty menacing on opponents too. And that being Gator fans can check out with the best of them. If this comes November and this season's down the toilet, the swamp will be half empty. But early in the season, when they think there's even a sliver of hope and a rival's coming to town, swamp's going to be rocking on Saturday for that game against Miami. You mentioned, John, the heat. I have to point this out. The only reason I know this is because my sister lives in Northwest Indiana. The forecasted high temperature in South Bend, Indiana on Tuesday, 99 degrees. So maybe touchdown Jesus smiles upon the Irish as they prepare for their trip to College Station, Texas, sending a heat wave through South Bend and prepping for their trip to Texas.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And I thought about that possibility as I was saying it. However, the heat and humidity in South Texas, you might have the same number there at College Station. It's going to be hotter. I promise you, the Irish will be less comfortable there than they were even in 99 degrees in South Bend.
How much chance do you give Clemson in this opener against Georgia? That's a game I'm going to be covering on Saturday, and this is a top 15 clash. It's going to be the noon Eastern kickoff game on ABC. A lot of eyeballs on this one, but just when I think about this, big games, I'm almost looking past this one, and maybe Georgia will too, and Clemson can catch him napping. But when I look at Georgia and what they've done non-conference the last couple of years, maybe it's just because of that 2022 game that was billed as supposed to be this huge challenge for Georgia when they played Oregon, and they absolutely just crushed the life out of them. The final score is 49-3, and I know this isn't the 2022 Georgia team, but maybe it's just because of the memory of that game. Because I like Georgia not only to win but win comfortably in this, but maybe I should be thinking back to, just a few years ago. I think about that Oregon game, but it was the 2021 season, John, where Georgia had all they could handle in a low-scoring slugfest against Clemson in the season opener. So I guess what I'm asking is, am I sleeping on Clemson? Am I giving Georgia too much credit when I look at this game and think, top 15 clash, okay, that's fine, but Georgia goes out and proves to everyone why they're number one in the country? Because that's kind of what I think, even though, like I said, when these teams met a few years ago in 2021, it was a 7-point result in favor of Georgia. And I guess I'm just colored by that 2022 non-conference game against Oregon.
As well, you should be. You basically pretty much stated that the ACC barely deserves to exist in college football. So
pretty much,
there's no point in backing off at this point. You've gone way too far. You can't throw enough bouquets Clemson's way to change anybody's opinion on where you stand. But say I agree with you, and yeah, there are exceptions. But I look at Georgia the way I once looked at Alabama, and I think Kirby Smart's the best motivator in college football. I've listened to snippets from his press conference. I just think he really connects with players, and not just in a pep talk. I'm just talking all week long. I think he will have Georgia ready to play. And we know what happens when Georgia's ready to play.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of those games where Kirby's going to say, we got to play to a standard here. And we don't care how good Clemson is. We give them credit for having the courage to play us, but beyond that, we don't give them any credit. We got to play to our standard. I mean, let's go back to Georgia's last game. I mean, it was going for 3 straight national championships, gets eliminated, can't make by losing to Alabama in the SEC game, can't even compete for national title, when both of us thought if they get in, they're immediately the favorite. And I still think they would have won the playoff if they'd have been in it. But despite all that, so what else was Georgia shooting for? It didn't win the SEC. It lost its shot at a 3rd straight national title. Yet it goes out there and plays Florida State, which suffered massive attrition, didn't have its quarterback, dead team walking. And I mean, you would have thought that Georgia would have let up at some point. Yeah, it'd come out and uh, assert its superiority, and then kind of, just kind of kick back and just play out the string and win the game. No, it looked like it did against TCU the year before when it was trying to win a national title. It just says, we aren't just going to win this game. We're going to prove to everybody that we're the number one team. I don't care what our ranking is. I don't care what happened in the college playoff or the SEC game. We know we're the best team, and we're getting ready to show you. I think that's what's going to happen to Clemson.
Yeah, and I mentally in my mind, I guess I've replaced Alabama with Georgia now. I mean, you hit on that. When Alabama with Nick Saban would play these so-called marquee non-conference clashes. Now I know last year was different with Texas, and that's why a big reason why I think Texas has so much respect going into the season is they went into Tuscaloosa, beat Alabama in that non-conference clash last year. But for most of the Saban tenure, there'd be all this buzz about a week one game, and then Alabama would come out and just absolutely pummel some team ranked like 17th in the polls, and you'd get to see how much difference there was between number 1 and number 17 in college football. And mentally, I guess I've just replaced Alabama with Georgia now, and I don't know if that's right. I think this season will go a long way in telling us whether that's well earned or not, but I think I've just on some level already done it because I'm now giving Georgia the respect I used to give in Alabama going into these week one games where you see number 1 versus number 14 and you think, well, that's really cute. Number 1's going to beat them by 3 touchdowns or more because that's what Alabama would do. There'd be all this buzz about their early non-conference games, and then the game would arrive and they would just crush their opponent, and you'd think, why was there all this buzz for this game?
Yeah, I remember this Alabama Southern Cal game.
Yeah,
I don't know
that was
what
one
year
in
it
my
was.
mind.
Huh?
Yeah, that was one that was in my mind.
Yeah, it was like 51-10 or something. I mean, it was just hard. I mean, total domination. Um, and I think Georgia has earned this status. I think it's truly earned it. You can't be perfect, and it did lose to Alabama in that playoff game. But if they played again the next week, I'd have picked Georgia. If you ask any team, I don't know, say the 15 teams this year, preseason, ask the coach if any one of those teams say, here's a hypothetical. Your team is going to end up playing for the national title. And you have the right to pick one team that you won't have to play. Whom would you pick? I think it'd be 90% would pick Georgia.
Something else, John, I referenced the 2021 game against Clemson. That was a 10-3 result in favor of Georgia. Georgia was still figuring out its quarterback situation in that game. If you recall, JT Daniels was Georgia's quarterback, whom, had all this hype as the transfer, but let's face it, by the end of his career, he was a journeyman. He did not play up to the hype. And after that game, by the end of September, can't remember when exactly it was in September, but by the end of September, Stetson Bennett was Georgia's quarterback, no questions asked. And JT Daniels had an injury mixed into there, but really, I think Kirby just realized he had to make a change, and then that was all she wrote. And we know how that went from there. For Georgia, they ended up winning the first of their back-to-back national championship games. But the asterisk to that season that's kind of forgotten about was JT Daniels started the year as the starter. Well, this year, there's no mystery around Georgia's quarterback situation. We know what they have at quarterback. They have one of the best quarterbacks in the country in Carson Beck. And so I think that's another reason why when I think, is this more likely to be closer to a repeat of 2022 when Georgia creamed Oregon, or is it more likely to be a repeat of 2021 when they barely skated past Clemson? In truth, it'll probably be somewhere in between. But if I'm picking one to be more likely, I think I'm thinking 2022 because they have their quarterback situation figured out. They're not messing around with the JT Daniels equivalent. They got a guy who's a Heisman frontrunner.
Well,
and Clemson doesn't.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. I'd forgotten about that. I mean, Clemson although Clemson had a chance to win that game, a 7-point game, I always felt like it was in hand. Like Georgia was playing a game and it was going to get the decision at the end, but it wasn't going to be a knockout. Stetson Bennett would have played. We saw what he did that year. That would have been a knockout. I mean, I don't think that game would have been close. That's how much he meant to that Georgia team. So I'm glad you brought that up. Clemson should look back on that game and recall how lucky it was.
All right, let's get to our picks, John. The final records last year were, well, I don't remember what the final records were. One of us won, one of us lost. Maybe it's one of those awards hanging on the wall behind you. Maybe you got a plaque for beating me. I don't particularly recall, but I'm about the here and now. I'm going to be winning this year's competition. Plaque's going to me.
I have no idea which one of us won.
Neither do
I would guess you had a lead at one time and you kind of were fading down the stretch, but no. So
okay. Well, we got
no plaque.
We got 4 games to pick this week, and our much anticipated lock of the week will round it out. So we've been talking about Clemson against Georgia. Let's just start with our picks there. Georgia, a 13.5-point favorite, and I think I've spoiled the surprise. You know where this one's going. I'm going with Georgia to cover the 13.5-point spread. You obviously know how I feel about the ACC. I've put it in the dumpster, but I never thought Clemson was the pride of the ACC this year anyway. I do think Georgia is going to be the pride of the SEC. I think they're Georgia and Ohio college football. I think that'll be apparent in this opener. It's in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, so a de facto home game for Georgia. I say they cover the 13.5.
Early in the season, I like to pick underdogs, but I can't do it in this game. I just like Georgia too much. I just think if Georgia's psyched and ready to play, and there's no reason it wouldn't be for an opener in Atlanta against these schools used to play more often, and I can't see any reason Georgia wouldn't be at its best for an opening game. So I like UGA to cover as well.
How about another game we've touched on, John? You want to bat leadoff for us on Notre Dame at Texas A&M. One of the more interesting games in not just the SEC, but college football this week. First game of the Mike Elko era. One of the undertones of this game is Notre Dame's quarterback is Duke transfer Riley Leonard. Well, Mike Elko was the coach at Duke, now at Texas A&M. So some interesting subplots for this one. Aggies 2.5-point favorite. Who are you taking?
Well, that's a tougher pick, I think, but I do like the Aggies and Riley Leonard. I've seen him do some really good things. He's certainly a running threat, but I still think A&M might have the quarterback edge here. Maybe I'm higher on Connor Wigman than most people are. He was a former 5-star recruit, but he's had some injury issues, and I think A&M's offensive line will be pretty good, and he's got some proven receivers. So I'll go with the Aggies, and I just am really a proponent of A&M at home because of that fan base and how riled up they can get.
One of my strategies, and I have no real evidence to back this up, but in games that I feel are coin flip games, I like taking the points. If I think it's a coin flip anyway, give me a couple points in my direction. Well, Notre Dame's getting 2.5 points, and so even though they're on the road, because I feel like this is a 50-50 game, I'm going to take the 2.5 points and take the Irish. Another game with a 2.5-point spread where I'm taking the points, John, is the Miami at Florida game we discussed. I'm taking Florida and the 2.5 points. I think Florida is going to win outright. And what's going to be interesting is, if they beat Miami, there's going to be all this buzz and the idea that you can kill off the hot seat for Billy Napier. Well, we know how tough that Florida schedule is, and we know how loaded it is late October throughout the month of November. So it's very plausible Florida could race out of the gates and still finish about 5-7 and still finish with a coaching change. So this is a game that is just ripe for overreactions, regardless of how it goes. But I it's interesting because I think Florida, just in terms of their depth chart, in terms of their roster, I think this is Florida's best collection of talent since probably 2020, when I think they won 8 games with Dan Mullen. I think they're in a little bit better shape roster-wise than they've been the last couple seasons. I don't know if the record's going to show that because of how tough the schedule is, but in this particular game against a team from the ACC at the Swamp, I know Florida fans are going to be engaged with this one. I will take the 2.5 points, and not only that, if I were picking it straight up, I'd still pick Florida.
This is the hardest game for me to pick of all the SEC games. And just looking at college football in general, I think it's a very difficult game to pick because you're right. The Swamp can still be very proactive in a season opener. One thing though that strikes me, aside from the fact that I don't have confidence in either one of these coaches, so that's sort of a push. It's a big deal for Miami to beat Florida. I think Miami will be really motivated for this game, even though Florida's not. This isn't Florida of the Steve Spurrier days or the Urban Meyer days. It's not even the Dan Mullen days. But I still think in that state, those other in-state schools, Florida's the one that's got that SEC membership. And and other teams, I think, look at it. It just means something to beat Florida. I'm not sure how well Cam Moore will do as quarterback with this Miami team, but he's got ability. He's got a proven track record, a lot of experience. And I like Graham Mertz, too, the way he played last year, but I'm just going to have to pick Miami. But this game could go either way with the spread.
I think so too. It's one of those games where I always say if I had actual money on the line, I'd stay far, far away from picking this game. But I don't have any money on the line, so it's with great confidence that I pick.
Who cares?
The Gators. Yeah. So we're going in opposite directions on this one, just like we did on the Texas A&M Notre Dame game. Game we haven't talked about, John. LSU against Southern Cal. LSU 4.5-point favorite. Now the backdrop of this one is LSU in the first 2 years of the Brian Kelly era opened the season with losses to Florida State. Now, they recovered from both those week 1 losses to win 10 games in each of those seasons, but I don't know if it's a trend we can read into or not, but it's certainly an interesting fact that in the openers with Brian Kelly, so far LSU is 0-2. Now, I'm just not that high on Southern Cal. Caleb Williams, I think I know you're a believer in the transition there, Miller Moss, that it's not going to be this. You're a believer, yes, in Miller Moss that there's not going to be this catastrophic drop off. Yeah. I don't know. I know he looked good in the bowl game for Southern Cal, threw for like 6 touchdown passes against Louisville, but I just wonder about that transition, losing Caleb Williams to the NFL, and we know you can't put a lot of stock in Southern Cal's defense. Now, we knew not to put much stock in LSU's defense last year, but I just keep thinking, and I haven't seen the evidence of it yet, but I'm thinking with the change in defensive coordinator, and we know what Blake Baker did for Missouri's defense, night and day difference for Missouri's defense. That's where Blake Baker was before LSU hired him this offseason. I just have to think, without much proof yet, but I just am thinking LSU's defense is going to be notably better this year. So despite the history of Brian Kelly and his openers at LSU, I'm taking LSU to win, and I'm taking LSU to cover the 4.5-point spread. I know how highly you're starting to think of Connor Wigman at Texas A&M, John. I feel like I'm sort of in that camp for Garrett Nussmeier. I've become like the unintentional champion, president, treasurer, secretary, the whole bit of the Garrett Nussmeier fan club. I'm really high on his abilities. I think LSU's offense won't be quite as dynamic as it was last year, but I still think it's plenty good, and I think the defense is going to be better.
I like Garrett Nussmeier too. I mean, if the dues aren't too high, I'll join the club.
Okay. All right.
Just send me an email on that. Yeah, I've really changed my opinion of Lincoln Riley. I mean, I thought he was the best thing going there at Oklahoma, and I thought he was just going to keep going up and wait till they get a defense. Wait till they load up that defense with typical Sooners. It never happened. And now that out at Southern Cal and watching that team last year, good gosh. I mean, yeah, it had Caleb Williams. It should have been able to outscore teams. Southern Cal doesn't look really motivated, and I've thought that a lot through the years. There are a lot of games where Southern Cal just doesn't seem motivated. I always think of it as a Hollywood team, wants to put on a big show. The show doesn't happen right away, loses interest. Oh, we're not going to score 63 today? Well, what's the point? And next thing you know, they're fighting for their lives against Oregon State. This kind of game, I just don't like USC in it, a season opener. I like what Miller Moss did in that bowl game. You're right. He looked great. I don't think quarterback's a problem here. And I'm with you. I just don't believe LSU's defense can be I don't think it's possible to be that bad 2 years in a row. So I like LSU to cover in this game. And one thing, I will be surprised if LSU doesn't have a home field advantage. I know it's real easy to drive over to Vegas from LA or take a short flight, but there's going to be a lot of LSU fans going out there to Vegas. You know, they're used to gambling at a truck stop in Houma, Louisiana. And we go to Vegas, man, and so we'll take that town down. And so I mean Vegas was made for LSU fans. I think they'll have I think they'll have a huge home field advantage in that game.
Oh, yeah. It's set up perfectly. LSU fans can fly out for the long weekend. This game's on Sunday night. Drink their face off down at Fremont on Saturday night. Recover with a boozy brunch on the Strip on Sunday, and then just go into Allegiant Stadium, good and liquored up on Sunday night, and have a Tiger takeover. You are right. Yeah, I think LSU fans. We'll see how it goes, but the best prediction you've made in this podcast is that LSU fans are going to outnumber Southern Cal fans in Las Vegas on the doorstep of LA. But we know how this goes.
Well, I tell you what, LSU fans, I don't know if it's to their credit or not, but they can play hurt. Hangovers don't get them down. They play through that.
No question. All right, that leaves us with our lock of the week, John. I'm not going to waste much time on mine because don't ask me for a justification for it. But there's betting lines on everything these days. Used to be you'd kind of struggle to find a betting line for an FCS game whenever one of the big dogs are playing the FCS opponent, the formerly known as Division I AA. Sometimes you would struggle to find a betting line for those games. Not anymore. Those lines are readily available. Well, BYU is hosting Southern Illinois this weekend. One of the great mascots in college football, John, the Salukis, the SIU Salukis. Well, as good as the mascot is, BYU favored by just 14.5 points against SIU. A lot of respect for the Missouri Valley Football Conference from the odds makers. Well, I respect BYU at home against FCS opponents. So I'm taking BYU to win and to cover the 14.5 point spread against the Salukis.
I think that's a very good analysis. I don't have much of an analysis on my pick. Just sometimes don't you just look at a game and think, boy, that team might win. You really don't even know that much about it. You just look at the game, the matchup, and say, yeah, I could see that happening. I see an upset there. So that's kind of what I did with West Virginia. I did that like about, 2 months ago. I was just looking through preseason magazines and I was looking at different opening matchups. And I said, man, Morgantown, hostile environment. don't like Penn State's quarterback. That's it. No more research. I mean, for all I know, West Virginia can't, they can't stop a team for rushing for 350 yards, but I don't know that. But I just like the idea of West Virginia season opener. And other people apparently like that too because the line has come down. I remember seeing an early line when I think it was 10.5, and now it's 8.5.
I think, it's at 8.5. But I
Yeah.
kind of like this pick too, John, because I'm higher on Penn State than you are. That's one of the themes of SEC football unfiltered. I'm always high on Penn State. You're not. I don't know why we end up talking about Penn State so much
No,
on
I
this
don't
show,
either.
but it always comes back to Penn State for some reason. However, the idea of them covering 8.5 with Drew Aller at quarterback, I don't know about that. That doesn't really seem like a good betting strategy. Now, I mean, they won some games in blowouts last year. Penn State did, and when they play these inferior opponents, they can lay it on pretty good. But yeah, I kind of like your idea of home team, non-conference clash, getting 8.5 points. I don't like your idea for an upset, but as far as taking the 8.5, I think that's a smart pick.
Yeah, and I don't have anything against James Franklin. I mean, I still remember what he did at Vanderbilt. I consider him a good coach, and he's done well at Penn State. But his teams haven't been as good as Ohio State or Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is the reason he's lost. It's not because of coaching. First of all, just get you a better quarterback. Drew Allar was
That old
supposed to be he was a 5-star recruit. As we know, the 5-stars don't always play like 5-stars once they're on board. And yeah, I can just see him in a clutch drive, ball bouncing off a receiver's hands into a safety's hands for West Virginia, and a long return coming up.
All right, well, the games are finally here. We're excited about it. We hope you're excited about our picks. And as always, you can take them to the bank. And if they don't work out, don't bother contacting us. We don't really care.
We don't
We
care
care
at
about
all.
we care about you listening to the podcast, though. We'll be back with you next week. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered. Enjoy week 1.